Translating ordinary sentences into logical statements. Introduction. Up until now, we have been studying arguments that we have thought up out of thin air. We've been analyzing the form of syllogisms, but we seldom find arguments in the real world that are in the form of syllogisms. We must learn how to analyze arguments as they appear in everyday speech and writing. It is sort of like cooking. Let's say we wanted to learn how to prepare a meal. We could go out and buy a TV dinner and put it in the microwave. That's one way to prepare food, but it isn't really cooking. Whoever put the TV dinners together before they were put in the package was the real cook. But if all we had ever done was cook TV dinners and were suddenly faced with having to cook a real meal, we would probably make a pretty good mess of it. In one way, what we have been doing is preparing TV dinners. Our arguments have mostly been prepared for you by someone else. Now, this is not a perfect analogy because we've been learning very important thinking skills by using these prepared arguments. But we do need to find out how arguments operate in the real world so we can use the skills we have learned productively. In this chapter, we will learn how to translate ordinary statements into logical propositions so we can analyze them using the principles we have learned. What a statement needs in order to be a logical statement. Ordinary sentences can have their logical components all scrambled up. In many cases, some of the components you need in a logical statement are simply missing, and you need to provide them. In other cases, they are lost amidst a jumble of other words. A logical proposition needs several things. It needs a subject and a predicate. It also needs a quantifier. A quantifier, remember, is a word such as all, no, or some. It needs a complete predicate, which sometimes involves adding a complement. It needs a copula, which links together the subject and the predicate. In logical sentences, this is the to be verb, is, am, or are. Rules for translating sentences. There are 9 rules for translating ordinary sentences into logical statements. Rule A. Clearly identify the subject and predicate of the English sentence. Rule B. Supply the missing quantifier. Rule C. Add the missing complement. Rule D. Supply the missing copula. Rule E. Change exclusive sentences into A statements. Rule F. Change negative sentences into E or O statements. Rule G. Change acceptive sentences into E or A statements. Rule H. Sentences containing anyone, anything, whoever, the, if, then, or whatever should be translated into A statements. Rule I. Sentences containing someone, something, there is, or there are should be translated into I statements. Rule A. Clearly identify the subject and the predicate. This rule is somewhat self-explanatory. We identify the subject, the word that expresses what the sentence is about, and the predicate, the word that tells us something about the subject. Now let's look at a few examples. Seldom do taxpayers get a break. A person takes a chance when he speaks out in public. No one becomes a politician and keeps his integrity. In a logical sentence, the subject comes first. This is also the case many times in ordinary speech. But that is not the case in the sentences above. Seldom, in the first sentence, is not what the sentence is about. Taxpayers is what the sentence is about. Taxpayers is therefore the subject. People who seldom get a break would, furthermore, be the predicate. When the subject is put in its proper place, the beginning, and the predicate in its proper place, the end, we get taxpayers seldom get a break. People who speak out in public take a chance. No one who wants to keep his integrity becomes a politician. Rule B. Supply the missing quantifier. Quantifier is a word that tells us a quantity of the statement. Words like all, some, and no are quantifiers. The general rule is that unless the statement says specifically that some is meant, all is meant. In the first 2 sentences we derived by applying Rule A, for example, we see that there are no quantifiers. We can easily provide them. All taxpayers seldom get a break. All people who speak out in public take a chance. No person who wants to keep his integrity becomes a politician. Some statements are a little less obvious. For example, Socrates is immortal is an A statement, even though it doesn't have the quantifier all in it. In logical terms, it really means all persons indicated by the name Socrates are immortal. In this case, that's only one person. There are also some exceptions to the general rule. Take this one. Americans are great basketball players. Even though it does not say some explicitly, it is clear that we are not talking about all Americans. Therefore, it must be written in logical terms like this. Some Americans are great basketball players. Let's also look at an example having to do with the negative quantifier no. There aren't any boys in the room. This one should be rendered no boys are in the room. Rule C. Add the missing complement. Many times we encounter sentences in which the predicate is an adjective. All taxpayers are poor. All people who speak out in public are brave. No person who wants to keep his integrity is political. But we must remember that in logic we refer to classes of things. When we say all men are mortal, we are referring to all members of the class we call men, and to some subset of the class we call mortal. And when we say Socrates is a man, we refer to the class we call Socrates, a class with only one member and some subset of the class men. When translating ordinary statements into logical sentences, we must remember to refer to them as classes. We do this by adding a complement, which is a word or group of words that completes a predicate. Therefore, when we encounter an adjective, we must change it a little to make sure we specify the class about which we are talking. The sentences above, for example, become all taxpayers are poor people. All public speakers are brave people. No person who wants to keep his integrity is a political person. In these examples, the word persons is a complement. Likewise, the sentence, all daffodils are yellow, should be rendered, all daffodils are yellow flowers or plants or things. In this last example, the class referred to is not completely clear. It could be flowers or plants or things. In the three previous examples, on the other hand, it is clear that the class, who are poor, brave, or political, is people or persons. In this chapter, we will be very explicit about identifying the class even when it is not necessary, as in the first three examples. Rule D. Supply the missing copula. A copula is a word that links together the subject and the predicate. In logical sentences, the copula means the to be verb, in other words, is, am, or are. Notice that when we applied Rule C, we also added a copula. All taxpayers are poor people. All public speakers are brave people. No person who wants to keep his integrity is a political person. When, for example, we take the sentence, dogs bark, we notice it is missing the copula. But if we add the missing copula and the missing quantifier and missing complement, see Rule C, we get all dogs are barking animals. Be aware that both Rules C and D are not often strictly followed, even in the examples given in this book. It will be extremely useful to know them, even if you do not strictly follow them in every instance. Rule E. Change exclusive sentences into A statements. Sometimes you run across a sentence that begins with the word only. For example, only men are priests. What do we do with a sentence like this? It cannot mean all men are priests. So what does it mean? In logical terms, what it means is all priests are men. Whenever we encounter a sentence like this, we must do two things. Drop the word only or none but and replace it by all. Interchange the subject and predicate terms. In the above sentence, therefore, we would take the sentence, only men are priests, and drop only and replace it by all, giving us all men are priests. We would then interchange the subject men and the predicate priests, giving us all priests are men. Rule F. Change negative sentences into E or O statements. We translate ordinary sentences beginning with the words nothing, none, or no one by doing these three things. Replace the words nothing, none, or no one with the word no before the subject of the sentence. add the cupola, complement the predicate. Let's try it on a sentence. Let's take no one frightens me. We replace no one with no. We add the cupola is, and also add the missing complement. Then we get no persons are persons who frighten me. We should also point out that English sentences of the form all, are not, are ambiguous. In other words, it is hard to tell how we should say them logically. Some of them should be E statements and others should be O statements. For example, the sentence, all people are not honest, could mean either no people are honest or some people are not honest, but most likely it means some people are not honest. The general rule is that we should always interpret such a sentence as an O statement unless it is clearly intended as an E statement. Rule G. Change acceptive sentences into E or A statements. There are some sentences that contain the word except. Unfortunately, these sentences cannot be directly translated into A, E, I, or O statements. For example, everyone except children may attend. By this we mean not one, but two things. No children are people who are able to attend, and all who are not children are people who may attend. One of these is, of course, an E statement, and the other an A statement. But if this one statement was intended to be a premise in an argument, we are faced with a difficulty since, in a categorical syllogism, there can only be two premises. But if one of our propositions was actually two, we would end up with three premises. Therefore, the rule is that only one of the resulting statements may be used, but not both. Any valid argument that contains an acceptive sentence will remain valid regardless of which is used. Rule H. Sentences containing anyone, anything, whoever, the, if, then, or whatever should be translated into universal statements. Anyone who has eyes can see. Anything that has eyes can see. Whoever has eyes can see. The person who has eyes can see. If a person has eyes, then he can see. Whatever has eyes can see. Any one of these statements can be translated into the statement, all persons with eyes are persons who can see. Rule I. Sentences containing someone, something, there is, or there are should be translated into I statements. All statements containing these words can be translated into I statements. These statements, someone is looking at me, something is looking at me, there's a thing looking at me, there are things looking at me, can be translated into the statement, some persons are persons who are looking at me, or some things are things that are looking at me. Although these rules will not cover every kind of statement, they should enable you to translate most statements you come across into logical propositions. Remember also that some sentences cannot be translated into logical statements, questions, commands, exhortations, etc. Since they do not express a judgment, they express other things. Only sentences that express judgments can be statements. Summary. In this chapter, we cover 9 rules for translating ordinary language sentences into logical statements. Generally speaking, a logical proposition needs several things. It needs a subject and a predicate. It needs a quantifier, a complete predicate, which sometimes involves adding a complement and a copula, a form of the to be verb, which links together the subject and the predicate. Some sentences, however, cannot be translated into logical statements because they do not express judgments, questions, commands, exhortations, etc.